Yuliya, thank you for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here.
So this is an auspicious moment to talk about the subject that you have devoted much of your talents to, which is the question of 300 billion in Russian assets that were frozen after the Kremlin invaded Ukraine in February 2022. And 200 of the 300 billion is in Belgium, I guess in what they call a central security depository, a term that I just learned this morning. And the Europeans have been eyeing this money for a long time, at least since the war started, because they know that the United States is not willing to pay or subsidize the war anymore. And it's on the European shoulders to pay for the military support of Ukraine, and then also to help keep the Ukrainian civil service afloat, to help the government. In short, to ensure that Ukraine can continue to resist the Russian invasion. Now, today, the Europeans were supposed to make or talked about making a decision, and they have punted on taking the interest, not the hundreds of billions themselves. Tell me, what is your take on what's occurring right now?
Sure, that's a great question and a very timely one, given that this all happened yesterday. To answer your question, I'll describe a little bit more about what the EU was envisioning. So it's not quite the interest. The EU is already taking the interest off of the frozen Russian assets as of 2024. In addition, collectively, the G7 has also issued an extraordinary revenue acceleration loan to Ukraine of 50 billion euro that is front-loaded with the interest on the frozen assets. So that's already done. There is agreement there. But what is now under consideration is using the assets to provide a loan for Ukraine, what they're calling a reparations loan. So the way that this would work is, you rightfully mentioned Euroclear, which is a central security depository in Belgium. Initially, when countries such as Russia or the Russian central bank buy assets, they are in the form of bonds. Those bonds have now matured. So there is about 200 billion cash in Euroclear. And that's a fundamental difference between bonds and cash. So under this plan, those cash assets would remain frozen, but the European Union or a participating coalition of member states would do a swap with Euroclear. So in return for that cash, the EU would issue some sort of an IOU to Euroclear. And so essentially Euroclear would still keep that money on its books, except on the form of that IOU instead of the Russian cash. The Russian cash then would be released in stages. So 50 billion would first pay off that loan, the ERA loan that I just mentioned. And then the rest would be provided to Ukraine over time as interest-free loans, which would only be repaid by Ukraine once Russia pays reparations. So either voluntarily or through a settlement. So in a way, Russia writes its own fate. So this structure basically allows the EU to say, we're not confiscating or seizing Russian money, because the claim still remains in place. We're just kind of transforming it. We're giving you an IOU that the EU would therefore owe you in case the sanctions were ever lifted. And then that money would then be returned to Russia if Russia pays the reparations to Ukraine. So, but there's a catch here. And the catch is that, well, what if Russia doesn't pay reparations, which is entirely likely, or the war continues on indefinitely? And the answer to that is nobody really knows. The problem also with this plan that nobody seems to quite has figured out is currently EU sanctions must be renewed every 6 months by a unanimous vote by all 27 member states.
Including Hungary.
Including Hungary and Slovakia, to keep those assets frozen. Time after time, Hungary has stalled, but not yet vetoed. However, that is always a possibility that's on the table. Hungary has continuously blackmailed the EU to take oligarchs off of the sanctions list in exchange for keeping the central bank assets frozen. This is a huge problem. There was a proposed solution.
When you say oligarchs, are you talking about Russian oligarchs?
Russian oligarchs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are two sets of sanctions, one on the private assets, so the oligarchs, banks, and one on the Russian central bank. So that's an issue there, and that's not quite one that's been settled. So what happened yesterday related to this was that, the EU is basically saying we would sign a contract with Euroclear that would provide a loan for Ukraine secured on those funds. But again, nobody knows what would happen in that situation. The EU was saying the IOU is as good as cash. We promise. Nothing. It's this. We're just swapping it. However, Belgium had issues with this. Belgium was the holdout. There was political agreement among other member states, but Belgium said the IOU needs to be as good as cash. We are not sure that it is.
They don't want to lose the money, in other words.
First of all, they don't want to lose the money, and they also don't want to be on the hook. In case the sanctions fail, Russia can immediately make a claim on Euroclear. And there would be nothing stopping that $200 billion worth of cash flowing back to Russia. So this is a problem here regardless. As long as the status quo is maintained, all that we really have is a handshake and a pinky promise from European governments saying we promise to keep it frozen. But what is actually underpinning that promise? Belgium does have a fairly reasonable concern here. So it required two things. It required the IOUs that would be traded for the cash to be as good as cash, such as bonds. Bonds would be a good alternative. And then Euroclear would have to cash in those IOUs in the form of bonds to Russia in case Russia came calling. So Belgium and Euroclear wanted to know exactly what the EU was promising. And the EU didn't have those answers yet yesterday.
Now, Belgium is also concerned because they worry that Russia would expropriate Belgian businesses that continue to exist in the country. Is that correct?
That's been used as a frequent counterargument to this among other countries as well, not just Belgium, but also Germany, who has agreed. There's actually more German businesses than Belgian ones in Russia. However, Russia has already been expropriating those private companies. Since April 2022, Putin signed a decree saying that it would be lawful under Russian law to expropriate and nationalize the assets of any country that was unfriendly towards it, meaning that any country that has put sanctions on Russia. They've already expropriated the assets of France, Denmark, German companies as well, Swedish, I believe, and a whole list. So there's really nothing to indicate that this is correlated to whether or not we seize these assets, whether we transform them. There's frankly already an incentive for Putin and his cronies to keep doing this. They're cashing in on those funds. They're going to keep doing it regardless.
Now, what about the prospect? Putin has been sending drones into Europe. He's been hiring people to carry out sabotage in Europe. Do you think the Belgians are worried that he would up the ante if they went through with this? That he would, in fact, become more aggressive? Because he's making very threatening noises.
I suppose the Belgians are concerned that this would be an act of war. I believe the prime minister said that if they were to do this. But however, that's simply not true. Russia is already escalating its attacks. Russia is already sending drones into European airspace. The only thing that would prevent it from doing so and to push Russia to the negotiating table is to seize these assets and send a strong signal to Russia that we are committed to deterrence and that we will not just sit back and allow this to happen. However, the problem so far has been that European countries, including Belgium, have simply kept their heads in the sand until this war shows up directly on their doorstep. I believe they've been operating out of fear of Russia versus supporting Ukraine and actually stopping this war along the lines at which it is now before it moves on to Europe. So this would actually be a way to stop Russia from escalating, which is a common misperception here.
So basically, Belgium, like other European countries, has been making a lot of money off Russia.
Yes. Yes, that's a unspoken fact on their part that I believe they don't want said out loud. And this is, well, there are two issues here. First, when the assets were initially frozen in 2022, before the EU passed the law that the interest would be sent to Ukraine, that left a gap of 2022 to 2020, between middle of 2024. Euroclear and Belgium pocketed about $4 billion worth of profit to their shareholders. That hasn't been sent to Ukraine. Further, the longer that these assets remain frozen, Euroclear and Belgium take a cut off the top. Euroclear is claiming that this is a litigation buffer to pay for litigation costs against court cases that are brought against it. But that begs the question, well, okay, first, that's billions of dollars. What kind of litigation costs billions of dollars? As an attorney, I could tell you, very few. And second, where are those court cases being brought? In Russian courts. When has the EU or any Western country ever recognized the jurisdiction of the Russian court system? The Russian courts just levied a judgment against Google for $5 trillion. Is Google going to pay that? So this is what's happening, and Belgium, post-tax, the Belgian state has earned $360 million off of the Russian assets in the first quarter of 2025 alone.
Which they're reluctant to give up.
Of course they are. Of course they are. Their prime minister has explicitly said that this is the goose that lays the golden eggs. So, I mean, the answer to this, too, is follow the money. Of course, Belgium is reluctant to give this up. And of course, they're going to fall back on legal excuses or political excuses or, well, Russia's going to seize our companies in any sort of universe. But the fact is that they are making billions of dollars off of the frozen assets the longer that they remain frozen.
Now, Mr. Putin never anticipated that his assets could be seized abroad, and that these assets would be, shall we say, even confiscated, right? That's come as a rude awakening to him. Right.
So this was a huge success. Well, first of all, the assets haven't been confiscated. They've been merely not yet.
Right.
They've been merely frozen, immobilized, I think is the technical term. So no, before the full-scale invasion, Russia kept its reserves in the West, and that's why
why
there's
did it
$3
do
billion
that?
here. Well, all countries typically do this. It's a way to diversify. It's a way for their country's central bank to ensure funds in various currencies. This is a very, very normal thing to do. Russia didn't anticipate that 300 billion of its funds would be frozen. And additionally, that those funds, that the G7 has made the promise that those funds will remain frozen until Russia pays reparations to Ukraine. This was a huge, huge success. But what's really needed now is that next step of actually seizing and transferring those funds to Ukraine. So Russia can't count on them being returned, especially under this 6-month sanction scheme.
How vital are those funds for Ukraine?
Incredibly, incredibly vital. The EU is running out of budgetary support. There's a funding gap for Ukraine. Its war effort requires about 65 billion euro a year. That funding is estimated to run out by, optimistically, the second quarter of 2026. After that, especially with the US withholding support, we don't know what will happen. And I would have to say, even with this reparations loan under this plan, which would extend about a total of 160 billion to Ukraine, that's about 45 billion euro per year. That still leaves a funding gap open without US support. So without the Russian assets, nobody knows where this money will come from. So Western states have a choice to make, whether this money comes from their own budgets or we use the aggressor's money itself to support the victim and to support our own national interests and security. In this case, I think the inaction that I mean, has happened yesterday, has been happening for the past several years, is still a choice that these countries are making. It's a choice that signals to Putin, you can outlast us. Putin knows that Ukraine is running out of money, but so is Russia. Russia can't sustain itself. So it's a race of attrition.
How likely do you think it is that the new sanctions that President Trump announced yesterday on Rosneft and Lukoil, two Russian oil giants, will that have a significant effect on the Russian economy?
Yes, absolutely. This was a bold, major move by Trump, which we applaud greatly, and it's long overdue. So Russia relies substantially on its oil and gas revenue. So this, in part, cuts that off. However, the other question remains open. Ukraine also needs funding to defend itself. So yes, we've undercut the Russian economy by some margin, but we also need to provide Ukraine with the resources to defend itself and additionally to reconstruct the infrastructure that Russia is continually destroying, as well as Ukraine's economy. But what the president can do, and currently has the power to do, is seize the assets in the U.S. The U.S. is not beholden to the EU's rules. And the administration can set an important precedent here and do what the Europeans weren't able to do yesterday.
How much money is here?
Directly, there's $5 billion invested by the Russians in the U.S., so $5 billion directly frozen. There's an additional tens of billions estimated in correspondent accounts. However, we don't know that number because it's classified. So one, the administration could declassify that. And two, the administration could still seize that $5 billion, which is less than what the Europeans have, of course. But what Trump has that the Europeans don't is gumption. And in politics, often the signal and the message can be similarly important as the number itself. This would signal to Putin the U.S. stands behind Ukraine. The U.S. is pushing Putin to the table, showing you can't outlast our support for Ukraine. And this would also accelerate the Europeans. It would embarrass them into doing what they have promised to do for years. But imagine if it were Trump to do it. I think that would be spectacular, and that would be a masterstroke by President Trump to secure, well, first of all, secure the U.S. as well.
How likely do you think it is that the Europeans will move in January when they meet again on this issue?
It's really hard to say. I think that most reporters, commentators, even officials thought that there would be a political agreement yesterday, but unfortunately there wasn't. But I do think that it's the open questions that were left open yesterday of what form are these IOUs in could be resolved. I do think they are they're kicking the can down the road. They're buying themselves some time, but this is something that can be overcome. However, I would say that the better solution, instead of this reparations loan scheme, which has contradictions, it has issues, let's be honest, is directly transferring those assets into a trust fund to Ukraine, directly using that Russian money instead of this workaround, which doesn't actually make Russia pay. It still keeps taxpayers on the hook.
How would Putin respond to that?
Putin would know that he can't outlast the West. First of all, Ukraine would have what it needs for the next 3 years. That's huge. That would mean that Ukraine outlasts Russia. That would push Putin to the negotiating table, which so far he has been reluctant to do. So this would be a complete game changer for the war. However, it's only a step one, because the reparations loan funds say that this loan goes through. It's to support Ukraine. It's to help Ukraine defend itself. However, the issue of Russia's damage to Ukraine still remains open. That's about $524 billion as of this February, not counting the recent demolitions. So we do still have a lot of money that we're talking about, and we are missing the accountability component under this reparations loan scheme because it's not directly using Russia's money. So we still have a long way to go. However, if this money were to be provided to Ukraine, at least this would be a strong step forward towards actually concluding the war on favorable terms for Ukraine and the West.
So you're an advisor to Razom. What are they doing specifically on this issue?
So I lead the effort on frozen assets globally as well as in the U.S. Razom me and Razom are particularly engaged in implementing the Repo Act. So the Repo Act is a piece of legislation called Compensation and Reparations for Ukrainians Act, which was passed in 2024 by a wide bipartisan majority and was signed into law by President Biden. It granted the authority to the president to seize and transfer Russian state assets that are under the jurisdiction of the U.S. into a Ukraine support fund, to then later be distributed to Ukraine according to various agreements.
Who would run the support fund?
The Treasury Department. So unfortunately, Biden did not implement the Repo Act.
Why not?
A number of reasons. I think political momentum wasn't there. This was around the time that the ERA loan was extended to Ukraine of $50 billion. So I think the thinking was like, oh, Ukraine is fine, they have $50 billion. But this wasn't thinking ahead. The other reason, too, is that Biden was waiting for agreement from everyone else, from the Europeans. But as we've seen, that is incredibly difficult to do. And if we wait for the lowest common denominator, we end up not moving at all. There needed to have been leadership, and unfortunately, Biden did not have that leadership, but President Trump can. So those are the main reasons there. But what Trump can do is implement the Repo Act. It's there. He can do it today to simply move those funds into the Ukraine Support Fund, which would be an interest-bearing account, and further to disperse those funds to Ukraine.
So you're saying Trump must implement the Repo Act?
Yes. Yes. There are currently 2 bills in Congress that have just passed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Wednesday. The one is called Repo 2.0, the Repo Implementation Act, which is a strong push for President Trump to actually implement the Repo Act. What this would do is it also gives the Treasury Secretary that same authority to move the funds into the Ukraine Support Fund. And it encourages the president to make disbursements to Ukraine in 250 million increments every 90 days.
Who took the lead in the Senate on this?
This was Senator Whitehouse and Senator Risch. So it was a bipartisan bill by the original co-sponsors of the original Repo Act. There's also in the House what's called the Peace Act. It's primarily a sanctions bill. But in addition to sanctions, there's also a provision in there that implicates the Repo Act, which, similar to this Repo 2.0, it gives the Treasury Secretary authority to also seize and transfer those funds. So there are 2 ways for this to happen. These 2 pieces of legislation passed nearly unanimously in their respective committees. All that needs to be done is put them to a floor vote. But really, the Trump administration doesn't even need these pieces of legislation. Again, he has the power. He has the authority to already do this. This would be one of the strongest signals that he can send to Putin.
So American leadership is critical.
Exactly.
Particularly to get the Europeans off their duff.
Exactly. And the original Repo Act was American leadership. This let it match initially when it was first passed under the Europeans. There was momentum, there was talk towards it, but as Biden stalled, the Europeans then stalled. So the world is looking to U.S. leadership, and this is a gap that President Trump can fill.
Well, thank you for your fascinating and informative remarks.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me here.